This is an oral history interview with Evelyn Machtel, Machtel, 1083 West Higgins Lake Drive, Roscommon, Michigan, 48653, on Thursday, May 16th, 1991, at the Oldsmobile History Center with Helen Earley of the center. Mrs. Machtel is the daughter of a former general manager of Oldsmobile, Jack F. Wolfram, and the vice president of General Motors.
The 64, 65. And growing up in changes, I just am really happy to be here, to be able to talk to you about all this.
Thanks, Evie. Let's get your address on where you live now and your telephone number.
Okay. We're retired up at Higgins Lake, 1083 West Higgins Lake Drive. Roscommon is the post office, 48653. And the phone up there is same area code as Lansing, 517-821-5184. And if anyone ever listening to these and has any other questions or any part of it that they want to know more about, why, I certainly would be happy to talk to them at any time.
Well, thank you, Evie. That's going to be very nice for historians.
Well, the thing that I have found is that this was an era, looking back, that is extremely unique. And my father came in as an experimental engineer in 1928, and then from then on just came up with the car. And after the Depression, and definitely after the war, the car was just coming up, and financially, and the country going from one car to three cars. It's a historical time in the automobile business.
Now, your father was hired in at Oldsmobile in 1928.
Yes, he came from Chandler Motors. Chandler Motors went kaput in Cleveland, and someone said, you know, you're quite an outstanding young man in engineering and very dedicated, and I think you ought to go up to that little factory in Lansing, Michigan. And that's what they did. My father was not an educated man. He had the equivalent of an 8th grade formal education, and then went on his correspondence courses, and if he had an assignment, something puzzling him, he just headed for a library. And he was out at Michigan State. Of course, that was the college then, Michigan Agricultural College. And he was very, very well known out there in the library, trying to track things down and educate himself. But he had a knack for it, and he also, obviously a gift, because he educated himself, and yet he knew so much and understood so much about the...
But you had mentioned in our conversation on the phone that he didn't feel he was a
No, he did. No, he had a philosophy that there was not a self-made man, that no one was self-made. The opportunities presented themselves. People helped you along the way. You didn't do it alone. And another philosophy he had was that from the moment you were born, the things that you had, like the difference between an outhouse and plumbing, that is something you had an inheritance the minute you were born, for everything that had been developed before. And you had a debt to society to equal that or more before you left. Whether it was in service or in volunteering or your job or whatever, if the opportunity was there, you owed it. And so I think this is what also accompanied his dedication. And it was an era of where the man was allowed to do this. There wasn't the competition of women on the force, or it was a different time, and a very exciting time historically.
Oh, and experimental engineering, what did he do? Did he have cars to drive when you...
Oh, yes. This was fun, because we didn't have a car. He had an experimental car at his disposal. He was the only one that could drive it. Lots of times it would be another kind of a car. Like I remember going around in the Austin, a little tiny midget car, and they would be camouflaged. And they would have cars like Studebaker and different other makes of cars that they would camouflage just to see how they worked and what the ticking was of it, you know. And he would talk about different dreams he had and why things should work and not work. And the hydromatic drive was worked on for years and years and years and years and years. I can remember him promising to take us to a show, but he'd get to the engineering room on Sunday morning, and we wouldn't see him till Sunday night. So it was very dedicated time for engineering. It was very, very scary. And I remember the family discussion. My father was really very frightened of the position. He had been thrilled that he rose to the chief engineer, and had the respect of his peers and everything as far as engineering with the automobile. And so he had reached his peak as far as he was concerned. And he felt that there was so much more about being a general manager, and also the idea of sales and public relations, to run a whole company was just something, and he was really very frightened. But they gave him time to think it over, and he started giving assignments to every member of the family. We all had our little areas of expertise, because my brother was educated, and so was I. And so we were told what, to study and to report to him. He didn't have time to do all this reading. And, well, mine, of course, was in the arts and in the cultural area, opera and dance, because I was a theater major and drama major. And my brother was, I think he pursued the politics for him. And we just caught him up on current events and different things that he would have to know about. I had an uncle that played around with the stock market as kind of an avocation. And so he was reporting on that aspect. But everybody had to help bring him up. And he was a man that never, in fact, we used to laugh. I used to think I never saw my father sleeping, because he'd be the last one in the house to ever go to bed. And he was the first one up. He was a person that really only required about 6 hours sleep. If he did wake up in the middle of the night, he'd read. And he was a person with his library, which was massive. He could walk to any book at any time and tell you what was in it. He was an avid reader on all subjects.
You mentioned this uncle. Now, was that your father's brother? Or
Yes, he was Bill Wolfram. He was in Dayton at that time with Delco, but he was General Motors. And then he ended up with Chevrolet. Worked on a lot of what we know about the Corvette today. He was the early, because I remember it was very secretive. They didn't want Ford Motor to know what they were doing. And I can remember taking my uncle. He'd come here to visit, and then we'd take him to the train in Ann Arbor. So nobody could be watching if he left directly from Detroit. He could be followed. And they worked on it a lot. I think it was either Chicago or someplace that he'd go. Very, very secretive in those days about whatever you had. The same way with Oldsmobile. See, Daddy was in engineering during the early years in the planning and the discovery of all the thing for the hydromatic drive. So that was Oldsmobile.
Do you remember anything special about that?
Oh, just that Daddy had quite a sense of humor, and when he'd explain things, he said, well, it would be a very wonderful thing for women drivers, because they wouldn't have to worry about the clutch. And that was a joke in our family, because my mother was known for bumping us down. When she finally learned how to drive, we'd have kind of a bumpy ride with that use of the clutch. But the rocket engine was another thing that he worked on extensively, and it was one or the other. And it could have been the rocket engine. Remember, we were all on a trip, and I joined them from California, where I lived at the time, in Phoenix, where they used to test a lot of cars. And he made the decision to come out with the rocket engine early. And it really, everybody had to crank up, but they needed that lead. And I think that was the philosophy that he brought to Oldsmobile. And of course, he had the wonderful opportunity at that time, because the car was becoming God in this country in the 50s. Once he was general manager, with dedication and love of the product and the engineering point of view in the product, it was very easy to make Oldsmobile just climb and become one of the leading cars in the nation. And of course, all of General Motors was climbing at the same time. I think the only car they canceled, and I'm not sure the date, General Motors, when they canceled the LaSalle. But I remember that one as a child, being in pictures, of the pamphlets. But I'm kind of deviating, jumping ahead and going back. The important part about the era, and I really almost want to quote my father in this, he did not believe in a self-made man. He said that was impossible, that there were too many other people that helped you along the way. Circumstances and opportunities, doors that were opened. And I think at that time, he probably was thinking of people like Mr. Skinner, that could be watching you and you don't know it, and have faith in you and help you along the way. But during this period, with people jumping from having no cars to one car, and then in the 50s, they actually, 50 and early 60s, went to a 3-car family. So you can imagine the way this nation was influenced by the car. C.E. Wilson had been president of GM, and he ended up Secretary of Transportation. I think that point was under Eisenhower, if my history is correct. And General Motors, as he made the statement, as General Motors goes, so goes the country. And it did. At that time, it was good economically. As we look back now with hindsight and know how they did away with all public transportation, there's another side to that, whether that was all good at the time. But it certainly economically helped the workers across the nation, in which, you keep money in circulation, and it was an up time. And it was an interesting time for what it did. Like, the dealers became millionaires overnight. They were encouraged to really make over their businesses into first-class, beautifully modernistic showrooms. And I can remember helping my father with speeches, which had this kind of information for dealer meetings, and challenging them. And I'm sure that the company even helped finance some of them for them. And there were many, many dealers that, as I said, 2 and 3 generations existed on the original, say, grandfather who started an Oldsmobile dealership, and then his son and then his grandson would live very, very well, extremely wealthy men from that. It was quite a business. And Dad broadened his thinking once he became general manager. Engineering and the product was the most important, that it ran well. He even sent out letters. He was known that if someone had a gripe, they could call him personally at his home. He sincerely loved the car and had faith in the car. But he did have to help educate himself, and he gathered the expertise on public relations, on sales, on all other aspects of running a corporation. He's an extremely dedicated man. I remember him not so much as a daddy father, but as a man that I greatly respected. And particularly, if you think of the years that this was happening, I was away. I went to college, and then I went out the West Coast, was in show business and so forth. But so I got to view him much as you do. If you're next to a tall building, you don't see the top of it. But if you stand away and look up, and after you meet many professors and you work with many people and have, bosses of your own that you have to kowtow to, you suddenly realize that perhaps your own father is a pretty great human being. And I had the privilege of not only having him as my father, but knowing that he was a very influential man. At his death, we were amazed for almost 5 years, the thank you notes we got from total strangers. He would meet people on planes, and if he was interested in some young person, he financed their education. And it was uncanny, the notes and things that were revealed about that man that we had no way of knowing. But he remembered how people had helped him to get started and so forth. He was a very fair man. I had to laugh. I think he was a very hard person to work for. One of the general managers to follow my father, and whom my father was extremely fond of, almost like a father-son relationship, was John Belts. And I remember Johnny Belts saying, well, if you've ever worked for JF, you could work for God. But that's that overachievement that I mentioned, and the perfectionist.
Do you think that Mr. Wolfram expected the people he worked with to have that same?
I think he demanded it. And in probably in some ways, maybe through a frustration of and fear, as I said, not having the backup of the total education or holding a degree in your hand per se. He probably had a lot of drive and a lot of, you'd say, demands on other people. He had done it the hard way, so they could too, type of thing. I know that there was a couple of times within his 13-year period of being general manager that he, quote unquote, had to clean house. And it was very difficult for him to do, but he just would not stand on the, if you left work at Friday afternoon to play golf or whatever, you better have a good reason for sales or something. He was not a person that mixed playing with work. Now, he knew how to play, and he loved that side of life, and he was smart enough to entertain. I know he had a personal little plan. He was going to get all of the quote-unquote 400 of Lansing driving Oldsmobiles. And when he took the reins, most of them were driving Cadillacs or Lincolns. And he did that. He literally wined and dined, and he gave parties at Oldsmobile, strictly, red carpet, with orchestras brought in from Chicago. Florence Henderson would be the entertainment, Bill Hayes. And he entertained anyone that would have something positive and positive influence, either government, business, education, whatever. He would have them be a part of that big Oldsmobile team. So that he worked this way in the community also. Oldsmobile in those days was very Lansing-minded. He had a philosophy that where the people worked, that community not only supported them, but then the corporation owed them something back. And so he had great input. He demanded that his executives choose some kind of community service. He didn't say what. They could be on the symphony board. They could be on the board of a hospital. They could work with the schools. They could choose, or their own church, but they had to be actively involved on a volunteer basis within the community. And that was as important to him as their jobs. They had meetings over it. He wanted to feel the pulse of what the needs were in this community because this was Oldsmobile's home. And he successfully did that. And I think the community missed that. Of course, a lot of things happened, and he was the first one to admit, I heard him say this to Johnny Belts again, that he probably could not have been the general manager in the years that followed because of government regulations, inflation, the price, the cut, all these things that you had to do. And you had to become a negotiator with the unions, whereas in his era, everybody was so happy about the job, and it was a success story, more or less, that it was easier for him to be a dictator. George Romney was a dictator. A lot of your people that headed any kind of business in those days could afford that because they were offering the jobs and they were making the decisions. So it's the era that he was in that helped him do a lot of the things that he was able to do. But it took the kind of a man that didn't just take advantage of it and play, because he was an 8-day-a-week Oldsmobile fan. He loved the car. He really loved the car, and was very loyal to the car. One interesting story about the car was when I came back and my brother had passed on, and I was living here and had the advantage of starting with Mr. Gross in television when that first started in the early 50s, and then married and raised a family here. And as my family grew, we needed a station wagon. And I used to kid my dad. I said, well, I'm going to have to buy a Buick because you don't have a station wagon. Well, he says, can you wait a couple of years? I said, well, sure. So we kind of became the experimental family for the station wagon because we did have a boat we hauled, and we took the kids north and so forth. So they would find out a lot of things were wrong when they would design these experimental cars that we were allowed to drive in order to test, what does a station really need, the height if you're going to be sleeping in it with bedrolls, or what are you going to be hauling, and the weight in the different things for the base of the chassis and all that have to change. So that was kind of fun. The other thing that was developed, but if you have any more questions about the car, I kind of want to stay on my father's career and the car and that type of it. And then we could go to the choirs and the cultural activities, the community activities that we
Whatever
did.
you want to share about your father as the man, the general manager of Oldsmobile, vice president of General Motors.
When you think in terms of the man, we found some letters and things after he passed on. Well, I really didn't see them until after my mother was gone, too. He was still taking correspondence courses in '58. Now, he'd become general manager of Oldsmobile in '51-2, and he also was the vice president of GM. They automatically did that within a 2-year period. All of the general managers of whatever division, Frigidaire at the time, Cadillac, Pontiac, Chevrolet, all of them, automatically became vice presidents. And they had their meetings in Detroit, of course, at the GM building, and they met regularly. So it was kind of an echelon where he thought of Oldsmobile first, of course, but he also was in the decision-making process of General Motors plans on the overall. And that at one time, there again, I don't know if it's a hydromatic drive or if it was the rocket engine again, but it was something they were working on. It was some part of some engine. It could have even been something else that they were going to put on one of the other cars. And he really had to fight in Detroit to have it put on and stay with Oldsmobile, where it had been discovered, developed, in the whole bit, right here. What that exactly was, maybe some of your engineers, if they're around, could tell you.
I think it's hydromatic.
It could have been, okay, because he would have been closer to that, because he was still chief engineer in those days, and had worked on it for, I think, and Harold Metzel, and a lot of the people. They talked about that for years and years and years, developing that. And that may have, you're probably right on that one, because he was really upset if that went on one of the other cars. I think he even threatened to leave. But whether he would have or not, I don't know. But getting back to this correspondence course, that we found that he was taking English and punctuation courses to write correctly. And, of course, he got A's, and he had wonderful letters back and forth. But it amazed me that a man in that position would still worry about not knowing something. And he wanted to be perfect in that era, too. He wanted to write his own speeches. He knew that he'd have to hand them out to the press, and he wasn't going to be caught in a grammatical error. So that was really interesting, and unbeknownst to anybody in the family, just to find these tests and all this correspondence was really neat. The other thing he did as general manager, which kind of counteracts the hardness that perhaps he was treating some of the men, he decided early on that all wives should travel when their husbands had to go. At least they had the choice. If their families, for family reasons, they couldn't, that was all right. But the top executives, as they flew around the country to the motoramas and to all the dealership announcement shows, and there was a lot of travel time, and he wanted the wives with him. He had 2 reasons for this, and it was quite unique. One, he said, well, it holds down on scandals, because quite often if the men had to be away from home any length of time and they were under a lot of pressure, perhaps they would play and relax hard too, and there's always an element of the female population hanging around just for that sort of thing. So he wanted the wives with him, and they were wined and dined, and they had wonderful experiences and receptions and things to honor them. The second reason he felt this was very important was that if the wife had some of the glamour, some of the nice part of her husband's position, then she was backing his position more, and she'd be more sympathetic at home and more understanding, which in turn made this man a better worker. And it was unique that he had thought that all through, and probably on his way up, things had maybe happened with executives when he was, low man on the totem pole, that he had seen that helped him develop that philosophy. But it worked, and it was quite a time. Oh, those General Motors motoramas were something else.
Do you remember any special incidents about them?
Oh, well, when you go to New York, or they're always the stars. Oh, and the ones in California. I have pictures with Dinah Shore and Celeste Holm and Bing Crosby and Bob Hope. And I mean, all of these people just crowded around the cars, the General Motors cars. And a lot of them became, like, Dinah Shore, with Chevrolet, a lot of them became hired through that. I mean, as I said before, at that era, the car was extremely important in this country, and I'm sure in the world. It was employing a lot of people. It was economically the greatest part of our nation at that time. Relative to the job, I think I've probably highlighted most of the things.
What about the rocket engine? I know Mr. Wolfram was in on the ground floor of that. Do you
Yes.
talking with him or any incidents with people involved with him on the engine?
Well, I remember the meetings that they had in Detroit relative to making it. They named it the Kettering engine. And I remember Mr. Kettering being here. There were interesting people that I found in pictures that would have gone down the line. Of course, Kettering and the people connected with GM, Sloan and so forth. But Haile Selassie had a Oldsmobile designed for his grandson. And they all came in entourage and watched the car being built. They were here for several days as guests. And also MacArthur, after the war, General MacArthur, and I think it was Somerville. Wasn't there a General Somerville? He also ended up in something in Washington after the war. But there was a lot of input because Oldsmobile had built, war parts or either the cannon or something. And so, yeah, so they had input to the Washington quote unquote crowd, and they had come into. So then after a while, when they were making the car again, why they often would be having guests, and I'm sure it went through PR. It's under Les Carlson and then Jack White, and those were the years when they sponsored Miss America for a while. They were very active with the shrine parades. I remember Oldsmobiles were actually designed. They had the the hat and the what do you call it? I say sword. It's not called a sword. Yeah, the regular insignia, but it has a sword on it. But the I can't pronounce. Correct. Yeah, in fact, he was a 33, which was awarded. Yeah, he'd gone through I remember that also in the 30s when he first started doing that. And my parents would go, to the dances at the Masonic Temple. And I remember seeing my mother get all dressed up. That was another year. But there was another thing that he was adding to his life. And he was very active in the Masonic and the Knight Templars. And then, as I say, he got involved in the Oldsmobile car with the Shriner parades. Community-wise, a very interesting thing happened. My husband was a musician here in town. We had our voice studio and drama studio. And he also, along with teaching, he had a lot of choirs at the First Presbyterian Church. He'd been at Central Methodist Church, so he was a minister of music. And at Lansing Community College, he'd started a lot of things. Well, during this time, he was asked to be the Ingham County chairman of Michigan Week.
What period of time would that have been?
Well, I clock things and remember things from pregnancies, so that I can tell you exactly when it would be, 1957. That he became, and we thought, well, let's take music in education. And so we did this. Well, then it was such a success in working with the boards of educations and the individual schools in the Lansing area. And we had a big 3-day show at the Civic Center at the end of that for Michigan Week. The next year we thought, well, let's do music in industry. And so we did. And my husband, for his dissertation, for his doctorates, had written on music and the arts for the common man. And so we decided that, as we know now, music therapy is excellent for all kinds of things. And so we went and we convinced the powers to be. And of course, it was fortunate too that my father would be in that decision area. But he bounced it off of PR and advertising and all the different departments and sales, and just said, well, is this something you think you could do? Well, we got a co-sponsor of Heckman Cookies. So between Oldsmobile and Heckman Cookies, we were able to put together from January through May a program of the arts and they were arts and ministry. And we offered to all employees and employees' families, members of their families, to participate in classes, which were held either, in the evenings or definitely on the weekends for the children. We had every kind of dance you could imagine. We had a band, we had an orchestra, and we had all these choruses. We had art classes in the auditorium at Oldsmobile. Yeah, we were there, and those days they were able to give. It was just a matter of signing it up, and first come, first serve. Organizations all throughout the community used that auditorium. I think that stopped when some woman.
Now we can pick up where we left off.
Okay, I think we were talking about Michigan Week,
Yes.
and the wonderful opportunity that between Heckman Cookies and Oldsmobile that we could finance this involvement of arts in all areas for the employees and their families. And it was fun. We got to know so many people. And
You were mentioning one woman. Something happened with a woman. That's why they cut out the use of the audience.
yes, it was really sad. Now everybody sues over everything, and in those days they didn't. And so General Motors had insurance, but they never. I think she just tripped on the escalator or something. I don't think it was anything ever very seriously, but she sued, and it unfortunately just put a damper then on everything. And I think if you were related to someone that worked at Oldsmobile, then you could have an in. But then they ended up just using it for their own things. Because right after this experiment, for Michigan Week, and that ended up with a half-hour television show, which Heckman and Oldsmobile sponsored. And the reason Heckman was involved, I should bring that up, he was the state chairman for Michigan Week. He'd been appointed to do that. And so with that, we got the involvement of Oldsmobile and then went on. Well, after that was all over, the following fall, see, Michigan Week's always in the spring. The following fall, the employees and everybody that had been singing in the choirs asked if they could continue. And so they sat down with some of the people that would be in on this. And we came up with a proposal what it actually would cost. Of course, the auditorium, we didn't have to pay rent on the rehearsal space, and they had to negotiate with the unions also, because for any performances, sometimes they might be off. But my father saw to it that they not only would be their jobs, they wouldn't lose that person working, they would replace that person working, and the person that was singing wasn't docked any pay. That was the thing that had to be negotiable, because suddenly you're in show business, along with helping to build a car. But once they petitioned and they worked out all the agreement, why we were off and running, and we had a mixed group of male and female called the Rocketeers, and we had a women's group called the Merry Oldsmobiles, and the men's glee club were the Merry Oldsmen. The teenage group were the Rocketeers. No, excuse me, that was the adult mixed group. Tornado Teens.
Tornado Teens.
Yes. And then the little ones were called the Jet Songsters. Remember the Starfire that they came out with, the big convertible? And I think they must have had the jet motor or something.
We also had a jet fire.
Okay, that was it then. That would have been where we got that name.
62.
The Jet Songsters. And so they performed. We gave Christmas concerts, we gave spring concerts in the auditorium, but we also had television shows. And these groups were called upon all over the community to entertain. One amusing, ironic, really, story was during one of their big times of strife, with a strike that lasted quite a long time at Oldsmobile, the choirs had been booked for the National Red Cross convention that was going to be held here in Lansing. And the generals were coming from all over, and they had all these dignitaries from Washington and the National Board. And of course, they did keep their commitment, and they performed. And my husband was allowed to go through the picket line, and we rehearsed in the auditorium.
You mean the automobile union had struck, and there was
Yes.
a picket line.
The picket line around there, and my father could not get in. Everything was closed down. So with us going back and forth to the auditorium, we just went over to his office and got a lot of important papers out. so that they set up their administrative headquarters at the Hotel Olds, and the executives could go on with a lot of their long-range plans, which were in conjunction with Detroit. And with
would that be what, 50s?
It would have been in the late 50s, maybe.
Late 50s.
Yeah, I would think late 50s, because you see, if my husband and I were married in 55, and this child, when we started, it was 57. 58 was the beginning of the choirs. So you're talking about, yeah, late 50s. And but they sang the performance, and everybody thought it was great while the negotiations were going on, and then probably not too many friendly faces at the tables of the labor unions and so forth. The employees were singing, so that was kind of. But we had great times. We produced a lot of Gilbert and Sullivan shows. They actually did promotions, and every Christmas, my father saw that there was a week-long of entertainment at the Lansing Civic Center. And people could actually leave their children. We had marionette shows, all the choirs sang, they danced. I mean, we actually put on a first-rate production. And the parents then could go shopping, because also Lansing downtown was a big place to shop. We had a lot of stores open. The malls hadn't been in on either side of the town, and so consequently the downtown area was thriving. And with Oldsmobile's help, why they had these wonderful shows. People go, there was never any cost to them. They just gave it to the city. Brought in people like, there was a comedian, a lot of our peers will remember this. I'm sure there are a lot of young people that wouldn't, but he was called Guggenheim, and he was on Jackie Gleason's show. Yes. Well, he was brought in one year as Santa Claus. And of course, Bill Hayes and Florence Henderson were the Johnny and Lucille of Oldsmobile. And so they were always entertaining, and Johnny Carson, in his early days when he was just a stand-up comic, he was there. They had these announcement shows that for a period of time, they would get the rights to a Broadway musical, and they'd use it as a theme, and they wrote glorified limericks, really.
To go with the new cars.
Yes. And these were the announcement shows, and they held them at the Michigan Theater a lot. They held one at the Civic Center, but acoustically, it wasn't advantageous. They needed more of an intimate theater atmosphere, so they went to the Michigan Theater. And in fact, it might have still been called the Strand Theater before they made it over. But they had the idea of the Johnny and Lucille, of course, which is "Come away with me, Lucille," and Johnny was the man. So Bill Hayes was on board first, and then they had several different Lucilles, and finally they had Florence, and then that combination just clicked, and so they became the national sportsman spokes. Bill was the first one, then Bill Hayes, yeah, and the people that were just starting out in show business that found an opportunity through the Oldsmobile announcement shows, because they traveled with them and they paid them very well. We had Martin Balsam, which you remember on Wild Wild West, and how Westward One. There was some series on TV that he ended up. I think it was Wild Wild West. And then that was Martin Ross. A lot of them are gone now. Cheetah Rivera. She was just one of our dancers. And I got to know a lot of them better because I had a television show at that time. It was a talk show. And so it was at Michigan State University. And I didn't have to worry about, compensation, because a lot of these people, if I just gave them a video of their interview and their entertainment, that helped them with auditions back in New York. So whenever these were in Lansing, the announcement shows, we'd have the kids right after their production. They would race out and be on my show from 4:30 to 5 in the afternoon. And that was great. That was really, really neat. Another person I interviewed that was a spokesperson for Oldsmobile at that time was Jerry Lewis, the comedian. And that's when I found out, when he first started his routine, he fell down a lot. He acted kind of like a spastic. Dean Martin was his singer. And he was highly criticized for this, for muscular dystrophy as well as multiple sclerosis. And this is one reason why he headed up the fundraiser for muscular dystrophy, to change that image, because it was negative publicity for him. But it was like, you remember there was a time when we used to make fun of drunks. Well, now that we know what a disease alcoholism, we don't do that anymore. So this was an era of consciousness from the public, and that was taking place too. And I think it was with the advent of television that a lot of this change came. Yes, Patty Page was another one. That was she had a show that was sponsored. And all these people, of course, came to Lansing because this was headquarters. But it was an interesting era.
So your father really had a hand in bringing the Broadway type show to Lansing and tying it with Oldsmobile in the announcement show.
Yes, and then the choirs, the Oldsmobile choirs, he also brought opera stars. And Brian Sullivan and Gene Finn, Ming Young Dunn, a lot of them went on to be great stars. They would sing, and they did a production of Faust. They did one of Aida, Cavalleria Rusticana. And this was always open to the community too. Now the employees didn't have to memorize everything. They stood on risers, but they were costumed. And their
costumes,
everything. There was a cultural arts budget that Oldsmobile sponsored, and it was for the community. And anyone that was related to anyone that worked at Oldsmobile could be a part of these shows.
Their tryouts to see if you had any ability.
My husband auditioned the voice people. Yes, it was an echelon thing.
And the music was part of this cultural arts.
Definitely. And the shows that we produced, they gave concerts, television shows, Gilbert and Sullivan productions, and the employees came. We still, see, my husband's 77 now. I'm 65, and in our retirement, we still have people come up to us, and of course they seem like total strangers because they were children that remember those days and their families. And it's all over the state. And at Christmas time, we hear from people that I think sometimes they're just singing a carol perhaps in some city across the United States in their own community, and their memory flashes back to what did happen at one time in Lansing because of Oldsmobile, these tremendous week-long Christmas spectaculars. And we hear from these people, and a lot of them we really don't know. We can't remember them, but we see the choir and we see that period, and we know it was wonderful.
Were these programs recorded in any manner?
I think there are some of the old-fashioned tapes. You know, the looks like the tape you're going to wrap a package with. And I think also we have. Hopefully, they're going to be in those boxes I promised you I'm going to go through. Whether they've deteriorated, we have no more. We would just have to listen to them and see.
We have sent, some film that's been given or loaned to us. We sent it to GM to put it on video to provide another means of maintaining it.
That's right, for education. Longevity. I do know we have some records, some big, the discs, the big platter they used to call them, of the announcement shows with the original music and that sort of thing.
More of your choral.
Oh, I know it. Too. Yeah.
If you had tapes that you'd like to have us try to.
That would be wonderful. I hope we've hung on with our moves and cleaning out from my mother's home after she passed on too. But as I said, I've got boxes I have yet to face. And this has been since '84. I should be ashamed. But the ones I have gone through reveal some interesting things, getting back to Oldsmobile and the car. Number one, all of these momentous meetings, you don't see any women.
You mean the business meeting?
The business meeting were all men. See, women hadn't come into their own yet. And so the executives and all this, I remember I had on my television show, one of the two female designers that were in the designing of interiors and things in Detroit. And yes, and she was extremely young in those days. And this again would be 57 because I was pregnant. It was my last show, and we went out with a bang. We drove a car on that the girls had helped with the interior. It was a convertible, of course, and they were on. I interviewed them at that time. The other thing that was extremely interesting and shows the power of and influence of General Motors at the time. In '59, Again, I was pregnant, that's how I remember. We were in Detroit going to the opera, and we were waiting for my father, and he was extremely late. He'd been in a big meeting at GM, and when he came in, he said, nobody gripe at me for being late. He said, I have been at the most interesting meeting. We asked him what it was about, and he said, well, he said, going to the moon. And we looked at him wondering if he'd hit a bar on the way home. And we said, what do you mean going to the moon? And he said, well, he said, the United States is planning on going to the moon. And at this particular meeting was General Electric and several corporations across the nation, and of course General Motors, to pledge money for this. So you see, in the early days, before something was proven, it wasn't necessarily the taxpayers' money that put the first man on the moon. The corporations were heavy into this kind of sponsorship, and probably still are in avenues that we know nothing about, and therefore that's the tax break that huge corporations get, which, you know, you and I worry about because we think, gee, with our little salary, you know, we're still paying taxes and so on and so forth. But there is a reason for this on a larger scope that perhaps as laymen we don't understand. But at that time, he said what the argument was and why the meeting was late. They know they're going to the moon, but whether it was to be a soft landing or a hard landing, and all these companies that would be producing the rockets and the different parts that would have to go into it. I said, well, when is this going to take place, Daddy? Well, probably 25 years. Well, you know, in 59, you know how soon we got there.
Much before 20.
Oh, heavens, I think it was what? Less than 10. I meant to look that up before I came today, but those interesting things that we had privy to, when I look back now, are just fantastic. Came across some interesting things of my mother's parties that they went to that came with my father's position, which that part of it my mother didn't like. And boy, as soon as he retired, she said, I'm taking off my girdle and I'm relaxing and I'm not getting on another plane. Store up a passport that this is it, I'm retiring. But the interesting part was the invitations. And she kept some of them because they were from, like, Lowell Thomas. There were people on the national level that were interested in General Motors that, of course, they would be on the list, so to speak. And the early part of the 50s, they were cocktail parties. Late 50s, early 60s, they became receptions. And I think that through that era, again, society was changing, and they were becoming knowledgeable of alcoholism and the disease that it was. And so with that kind of thing, you went to a reception from 5 to 7 instead of going to a cocktail party from 5 to 7. It's just an interesting thing that kind of popped up as I was going through all these things.
Well, Evelyn, you mentioned that you do have papers and photographs.
Yes, and I've gone through some of these boxes the first time, and I thought, I'm not throwing these out yet. And I guess you're the reason I didn't. So I'm going to go through them again, a lot of duplication. But I do know that some of these pictures you may already have. But they are pictures with the people that, at the time, like Assistant Chief Engineer was Pete Estes. Well, as we know, he went to the top.
Sure.
GM, he started Oldsmobile and went on. So did Lowell Kintig. These people left engineering, and they were so good that the other divisions wanted them and made the job offers. And it was interesting to watch the competition, even though General Motors was, you know, the overall umbrella. There was great competition between the cars. They were, you know,
the car division.
Yes. And at that time, Buick and Olds were competitive. I think now it's Pontiac and Olds, but I can't keep track of it now that it's BOC. We don't, you know, have the same thinking about it as was then, because they were all climbing the ladder. It was a big change of the car, becoming a bigger and better car. And of course, now it's a smaller and better car.
Did your father ever talk about now, like the design, how the design of or structure of
Oh, yes. In fact, he had some wonderful paintings that were given to him by the artists in Detroit with, you know, showing the rockets and the different things. And it was kind of a modernistic approach to what probably could have been the future of the car. There's some beautiful things. And those two, I'm going to have to, if I don't find them, I know then some of my children have them. Because anything with cars, the boys were just grabbing left and right, you know, whenever we would move. Um, yes, he talked a great deal about that, although a lot of it, you remember they're working 10 years, 15 years in advance lots of times, and a lot of it was secretive. And by that time, I was away from here. I know a lot of people wondered about my father, my mother, and well, our entire family being quote unquote as down to earth as we were. I attribute that to two things. Number one, his success happened late in life. I was raised at 825 Sparrow here, you know, and remembered my mother helping feed the bums that came off the railroad track there, and they'd cross over during the early 30s and the Depression era. And I can remember her being at PTA at Barnes Avenue during the 30s, helping families that were out. So they climbed up themselves and consequently had a feeling. And even though he got to the top, he never forgot that. And the horrible tragedy that happened when we lost my brother, which was 51, right after my father had been appointed. Yes, we can, because the only aspect of it, as far as Oldsmobile, was the fact that my parents, I think, realized that they would have given it all up if they could have kept their son alive. But fate didn't have that in store, and I think that leveled them.
That was right after Mr. Wolfram
Yes.
became general manager.
And it's interesting that the same thing happened to Mr. Sanchez. He lost his son after he became general manager.
What happened to your brother?
He had rheumatic fever. Well, we both did as children. They called it inflammatory rheumatism in those days, but it was the rheumatic fever. And I seemed to outgrow it, but he didn't. Of course, I went to California. I was in better climate.
Was he older than you?
Yes, he was 4 years old. And he died at 30. And he left a little gal, which I'm very, very close to. And I'm very close to his ex-wife, his widow at that time. But that levels a family. It pulls you together, and you realize that the family unit is still the most important. And so Dad had his job, and he went, you know, full speed ahead as his position demanded. And as I said before, his job was, you know, kept the whole family and my brother's widow and the whole, you know, responsibility. And Mother was in charge of the family, as most women were in those days. Interesting conversation. Let me ask what I might have overheard. I was very much aware of those promotions because Dad, when he had promotions to make,
Oh, I see.
for other executives, he would ask me about their wives and being, you know, in the community, if there was, you know, what kind of people they were. The wife was actually considered very strongly in the decision-making process of the executive. And I think it was from Detroit, too. I think that, because this was prior to the scandals. This was prior to, you know, divorces. This era, those things didn't happen. If they did, they were, you know, not talked about, weren't brought out. So
Perhaps could have had a bearing on a move for a man, too.
definitely in those days. Yeah.
Okay.
Your backyard should have been untouchable. And when you think of Clara Metzel, and of course Pete lost his wife, but she was a lovely, lovely woman. But though they were of an era that, good or bad, I don't know, history will show, but it was a wonderful type of woman who was responsible for the family unit. And of course she didn't have to go out and work, and she didn't most times have the education to do that. But she was a lady at all times. And that was something that was expected, and behind her husband at all times.
You're speaking of Clara Metzel now.
Clara and my mother. And I think in the community you can think of Mrs. Stoddard, Mrs. Jenny Stoddard. The Coates, Mr. Coates, Murph Coates was head of Motor Wheel at the time, and his wife is another. There were a great many women in Lansing at that time that were the epitome of what I'm not sure we have anymore. As much coming up, I mean. Uh, most of those women have passed on, and they were behind their husbands 100%, come thick or thin. Um, and I'm sure they, in all of their states, they had a lot to put up with. Their husbands were away, they traveled a lot, the demands on their husbands, and perhaps that was another reason too then that my father in his time then included the wives on the trips, because he was aware that earlier on with his testing of the cars, he'd be gone, 6 weeks, 2 months at a time. They'd go down to Mexico to test those engines. And they were these test trips, and in the mountains out west as well as Pennsylvania to test them with the snow. And those were long trips. And so the wife was left at home with the family. And you didn't have babysitters in those days. Your place was home, and that's where you stayed.
Now, the computer testing hadn't come in when Mr. Wolfram was
Not that I was aware of. Not that I was aware of. The first I really heard about that was influence was when my husband got into that at LCC. Because then, everybody was involved. I remember, now I will back, I do remember Dad coming home one time and kidding my mother how she could be replaced. And she said, well, that'll be the day. But it was about a computerized machine. And he said that right now at Oldsmobile, he was able to give an order for something, and a machine was going down and getting it and bringing it back. I do remember that story. So they were into that part. And perhaps that was even one of the main complaints during that long strike that happened relative to, because when the computer mechanized, would come in, then employees would be let out. And I'm sure there was some bargaining from the union standpoint of keeping these jobs for their workers.
I just wondered if he'd ever had any feeling about computerized design, but on an automobile. But I see that
I don't think that was a part of it then. Yeah. If he was aware of it, it wasn't something that he foretold. Of course, you have to remember, during this time, my father had 3 coronaries, 3 very severe heart attacks.
When was the first?
The first one was at a Motorama, and he was in San Francisco. And that was the time Oldsmobile was sponsoring the Academy Awards. Because I remember they sent for me, and I flew out and went with my mother to take my father's place at the Academy Awards. They sponsored that 2 years in Hollywood. That was an interesting thing. I think it would have been, I do know, because I have my husband and I were going to be married. Well, my fiance and I were going to be married in April. My father had his first heart attack in 55 because we put off the wedding till May. Yeah, and that was in 55. Was his first one, and it was.
He was already in San Francisco when he said.
Yeah, they were on their way. I think he'd had a big dealers. When he had to represent General Motors at the Motoramas, he would also take advantage and have dealer shows for just Oldsmobile on the way, so that they weren't wasting time just flitting around for the Motoramas. But he had been in Las Vegas at a big dealers meeting, and then collapsed in San Francisco. There was a lot of strain with speaking and that sort of thing along with it.
Did he enjoy speaking?
Loved it, but was very, very, there again, his perfectionism. He had voice training from my husband, which a lot of people said, I didn't know you sang. And my husband explained then he vocalized him so he wouldn't lose his voice. The same way a singer warms up, a speaker must warm up. And so my father took that very seriously. He had lessons every Saturday from my husband. And at one time, my husband told my dad, he said, you could have been a good singer. Or, no, successful. He said, you could have been a successful singer. My father said, so? I mean, he had kind of accomplished something in the engineering field, so that was cute. But, yes, he wrote his own speeches and gave them, and he was very good at it. And I think he even helped some of the other executives that had to, he wanted them to take speak lessons too, so that they would, their best would come off.
Did he have any patents? To get back to his experimental engineering, were any of his ideas patented?
I'm sure they were, but they would belong to General Motors.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. I think that when it boiled down to, I think there were three main people, weren't there, on the hydromatic drive? I mean, there was all these engineers, but I think there were three that really were responsible. I think my father was one, and I think his assistant at that time was Harold Metzel. I don't know who the third one was.
Did he say he's speaking often about Mr. Metzel?
Oh, yes, they were lifelong friends. Yeah, I don't exactly know where it began, but I can remember going to their home as a child, and my brother and I'd be put to bed. We'd play with their two children. They had a boy and a girl, younger than we were. Dear Bill was lost in that awful fire. That was such a tragedy. And the girl was the oldest, but my brother and I were still older than they were. But they would be playing cards and parties. And I said, you didn't have babysitters in those days, so we were hauled along. And we went on camping trips together in the summertime. It was very close relationship. And that was one reason when my father had his third heart attack, that he knew that he had to resign earlier, or retire earlier. So he retired in 64, and he would have been 65 coming up. And so he put Mr. Metzel in. Mr. Metzel also was only in a year or so because he was going to be 65. And in those days, it was forced retirement. I don't know if it still is or not.
No.
Yeah.
No, the government regulation.
So he, at 65, he stayed in that year and helped Metz a lot. Metzel was a wonderful engineer, but he hadn't been experienced as much in the other aspects.
Like
but
administrative.
Or making speeches. He didn't want to make speeches, that sort of thing. But he didn't need to. But my father wanted him to have that high.
We're all set here. Wherever you'd like to pick up, if you'd mentioned Bob Octus.
Yes, well, this goes back again to the early days living at 825 Sparrow, and Dad used to walk to work lots of times. Probably one reason why he settled in that area. But around the corner were the Ogdens, and there was Donald was the oldest, and Bob was the youngest. And I'm not sure how old Donald was. Donald might have been between my brother and I, but Bob was younger than I, of course. And this has been interesting for me to watch because my father was very influential in Bob getting started at Oldsmobile. And I can't remember what he did first, but he certainly went up the ladder. Yes, and used to help me arrange cars when my mother would travel, that we could have something to drive through whatever local dealer it would be where she was. And at that time, that was permissible. It isn't anymore. And then when he's in the Detroit area, and I heard him speak when we were on a trip to Phoenix, and Mr. Witter was out there, and Mr. Metzel, and Mr. Elliott. There were a lot of people in that area that we were that winter. And so we went to several meetings and enjoyed the camaraderie, and Bob was speaking. And I talked to him afterwards, and he mentioned the fact that he was in Lansing a lot, but he was primarily out of Detroit. And I said, well, you ought to have a condominium. So he came over and looked at my condominium, and I was hoping he'd buy it, but he didn't. But it was just marvelous to remember this little boy in our neighborhood, and then to find that he'd stayed with it. And I'm sure there are many, many stories like that, because it's important to this community. Oldsmobile was the mainstay. It went from, I do remember this statistic, when my father left, it seemed to me it was over 20,000 employees. And when he started, I don't think it was more than maybe 8, if that many. So it was quite a period. And as I say, he was fortunate because the only way to go was up at that point with that product. And he could afford, he knew what he was doing, and he could afford to be the dictator when he got the general manager position to make things happen.
Now, you mentioned the meetings with General Motors were held in Detroit. Did he mention, do you remember any incidents about people in GM that he had mentioned? A little comical or funny?
Yeah, not not as much. There were some people he didn't get along with, I know. As the other people came up, they were very loyal to their division. Same way my father was loyal to Oldsmobile. People like Harlow Curtis had come up through Buick. And I think that might have been when there was some stressful times to make sure that what was invented and developed here at Oldsmobile stayed here and didn't get put on another car. I do feel
Been instrumental in seeing
that stayed here, yeah. Like the Cutlass, and then of course the jet that I mentioned before. They have that big jet plant out there. We used to go out there for him to practice his speeches, and we'd open all that complete fire lane. We'd open it from one end to the other, and he'd have so we could hear him. He'd know he had the volume because he had a great fear of a microphone going off. And he said he would just step around the rostrum and keep on with his speech. So we actually trained him that way. But you see, all of that was built. It was, I mean, the expansion program for the city of Lansing, because of decisions made in Detroit for the car to go up. And all the different models they had. You know, they started out with one car, and then they just...
almost too many sometimes.
Well, yes. In fact, he made that statement. I remember him talking one time, and he said, you know, this was after they reached the peak of the three-car family. And so, you know, that wasn't going to last. Number one, you might replace one car every year, but you're not going to replace all three cars every year, because the second car would be for the wife, and maybe the third one would be a used one for one of the kids. So the family's view of the car was changing. The Vietnam War did a lot to the car business. So that as this was changing, and my father was near the end of his regime, so to speak, but he predicted that there should come a time when perhaps they didn't make a car, a new model every year. He also was trying to get them to make a smaller car. And of course, they said, you know, well, this is silly. You know, the big car, this, and that's what's selling. Everybody wants the 98 and so forth. But he said, yes, but he said they're not going to be able to continue because of the gas. I mean, these things were just on the threshold. He was not, none of the changes came while he was in. But he was thinking ahead.
The subcompact, the F-85. We call it the intermediate car.
Yes.
That came.
Yes. Yeah, and that was what he had to fight for in Detroit. As they said, they wasn't, you know, that was a waste. But he was always thinking ahead, and I think, I have no way of knowing this, whether they still do, but I think perhaps when they stopped promoting engineers per se, and went into PR people or accountants. Accountants became head of a lot of the divisions. That the long-range planning perhaps got pushed aside a little. They were reacting to the public and the economics. They were reacting to government controls, which they had to do. But perhaps that's when the product was sacrificed. The product itself and what it could do, because through engineering they had these long-range plans because the development time, it took so long to perfect the different ideas. And we have an engineer in there now, which I think will help General Motors, but it's a different era. It's a different era for him too. But he came up with that philosophy of Oldsmobile, which I think my father deserves a lot of credit for. I'm sure he got it from Mr. Skinner, but there again, under Mr. Skinner, that was the war. That was a different era. So each general manager had a different time, but my father had such a long time that there again, it was an opportunity for great change and great influence.
And he made a difference.
He did. He was an outstanding man. And I say that with pride, and not just because he's my father. Had I known him as a man in the community, I would have made the same statement. Other people in other avenues, the bankers, he was very, very, very well respected in this. And in his retirement, this was another interesting thing to say of, I made the point of him being self-educated and never stopping. As he viewed his retirement, he also planned ahead. He knew two things. If you wanted to maintain your importance, you had to, be on boards and be active in the community, and it would take money. So he formed a foundation and put his GM stock and things in it so that at the time of his retirement, when at 65 he would be forced to retire, that he would still have giveaway money. That as long as he was getting his salary, he had giveaway money. But in retirement, that check would stop. He had investments, of course. But to maintain the top philanthropy, which he was known for, he knew he'd have to go to a foundation. And so he did that, and it was a very wise way to go tax-wise. And that is influential. You see the beautifully, it's a De Rivera sculpture downtown at the corner. And that was a design that my father was gone, but I know that he would have liked. I think it has had negative publicity, unfortunately. But it is a famous, famous sculpture, and it is something that changes with every season as it goes around and the light hits and the rain falls or the colors change. It's a very interesting engineering feat to watch. The mammoth duplicate of it hangs in the Smithsonian Institute in Washington. So it isn't anything that Lansing should be ashamed of. And I have great pride in that because they had the local people, the Arts Council backed it and so forth, but they didn't raise the matching funds. Lansing did not pay for all of that. It was a $90,000 commission, but Lansing only had to come up with $45,000. And I know that $22,000 came from my father's foundation to balance so that we didn't lose that in the downtown area.
Is that foundation still in effect?
No. With the tax invasion, the tax laws that came about from 69 on, put a terrible dent in philanthropy. And the foundation wasn't that large. It was what you'd call a small family operated. When my father was alive and could run it, he had a secretary and a office in the Michigan, and he ran it differently. When I had to take over the responsibility, number one, I didn't know very much about it, so I joined the Michigan Council of Foundations and started educating myself on the expertise, and fortunately was able to do a great deal in the community also through the foundation. I'm afraid some people thought I was giving my own money, which didn't help our family budget, but it wasn't. It was my father's foundation that helped the philanthropy that I was able to continue with. No, when we retired and everything, then I gave my mother's home to Michigan State, and I donated a large sum of the foundation to the green room at the Wharton Center. So Michigan State benefited a great deal from it, and those were the last things. We started an endowment with the very last amount, which is still going at Michigan State. So we were ready to leave Lansing, and it was a period, as I said to my children, and I know even some of my friends questioned my, giving the home away. It was a very beautiful home designed by my father, and in the period of the 50s, ultra modern, particularly for Cambridge Road. And that was interesting, too. A lot of people chose to move to East Lansing, White Hills, Oakwas, and he maintained that if you made your dollar in Lansing, you needed to live in Lansing. And he was the highest taxpayer in the city of Lansing because most people moved out of Lansing. And some of the older homes on Cambridge Road were not taxed as high. But he believed in, and he never griped about his taxes. He said that paying taxes was a privilege. And that if people were honest, they always had enough left. So those were his Depression days talking again. And it was interesting. Our family didn't... he never flaunted the money. He didn't live the money. He was a great philanthropist. He was great on education, and he was and for travel if it was educational. He planned in his retirement to get into the arts, which he did. He was on the board of the San Francisco Ballet and the Opera in New York, and became a real advocate of the arts. And whatever he took on, he studied. He analyzed, it took him 3 years, he analyzed and wrote Wagner's Ring. And he wrote a rostrum, kind of a lecture presentation. And we went to Germany one summer. He took my husband and I, and we taped all of the opera stars in Bayreuth. The Wagnerian festivals held there every year. And he paralleled Wagner, of course, in the early days, the family was very close to Hitler. And there's a lot of symbolism in the downfall of Germany that's reflected in the operas, within the operas, almost foreboding. And then Dad got the message out of the search and the frustration for the gold ring in the Ring of the Nibelung. And he figured that was very symbolic to what we were going through in this country with the materialism and the great love of things instead of the quantity of life rather than the quality of life. And he was very upset in his later years to see that changing, that people were not willing to hang on to the artwork and the music and bring it into their lives, because other countries do. And so he reflected that a lot in his retirement, although he did end up, he said he hadn't satisfied his power motivation in retirement. And so he meant that what you do in life is what your potential is. And he had leadership, and he knew this. Didn't know where it came from, and of course he developed it continually. And a power, in other words, whether he'd done it with Oldsmobile or he had done it in medicine, he would have somewhere probably still been a great achiever and a leader, because he could use the power in a positive way. And he hadn't had that satisfied. He influenced people in his retirement, but he didn't have that power motivator. And so he had purchased a big ranch outside of San Francisco, and it was default in a group of heirs who were squabbling over it. None of them could come up with the taxes, and he had been made aware of this, so he was able to take it over. And he was developing a low cholesterol beef. He crossed a chalet out of Canada and a Polled Hereford. And he had a laboratory out there and everything. And it was so far cry from what he had done in industry as an engineer. And of course, it put him close to San Francisco with the cultural aspect of his life that he needed and wanted and enjoyed very, very much. But this low cholesterol beef, of course, he died before he could develop it. But he was very active in the Polled Hereford, and he was all of the ranchers, highly respected in the community out there. Worked a lot with 4-H, and had influence there. With
what year did he die?
He died in 71.
No, he was in San Francisco then.
Yes.
Now,
Yes.
you mentioned that was his third.
Yes, that was the third. Well, the third one, he didn't die from a coronary. He had three coronaries. The third coronary forced his retirement. He went out in 64 rather than waiting until he was 65. That he was born in 1899, so his birthday was always the year that we were going into. So no, it was a stroke, severe. Was it thrombosis?
Cerebral hemorrhage.
Yes.
That was what caused it.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that have been quickly?
It was, and it was at the ranch.
Well, you would have wanted it there.
Oh, definitely. He would not have been a man. I think he remembered the Porter Hotel that was very active in the place for a long time, early 30s. Drew Porter laid in a coma for years and years and years. So did G.R. Jones, who was the sales manager under my father at Oldsmobile during his reign.
What do you think of Mr. Jones?
Oh, they got Rocket Jones. They nicknamed him. Yeah. I think Mr. Jones was a good balance for my father, because in the early days particularly, my father was a reserved human being. There again, probably feeling insecure, not having the educational background, but GR was able to give him the flamboyance to life that he needed, and more of a flair, to feel like the general manager, and to demand may be too strong a word for my father, but to have the respect that position needed. And of course, again, during that era that the car was going up, it was easy to maintain. But GR relaxed my father quite a bit. Les Carlson was another one. But you have to remember something. My father was an engineer under these people. He was chief engineer under them. And when Mr. Skinner advanced my father, he jumped the heads of all those people that were in direct line for that position. But Mr. Skinner was wise enough to know that if the car was to move forward, they needed an engineer at the helm, not a salesman, not a PR man. And so it was a good team, and my father believed in a team approach. He respected what other people had to offer.
What about Vic Sutherland?
Oh, he loved Vic dearly. And that was during a time that, Vic had been out in the zone, and he was brought in, and he was brought in, he was like, a lot of these younger people under my father really took under his head. I think it was because of the loss of my brother. And he actually perhaps dreamed and had fantasies of these young men, and he really helped them, really influenced their lives. And Mary and my mother were a lot alike. A lot alike. Very homebodies. They believed in the family and the importance of the family. No, it was a wonder. And Stroud. Jim and Virginia Stroud. And that horrible tragedy with the airplane. You see, and Dietz was on that. Carol Dietz and Jim Stroud were flying on that ill-fated plane out of Denver, which this insane young man had put a bomb in his mother's suitcase.
About 55. 54, 55.
I'm trying to think. No, it was David and I were married, so it had to be after 55.
6.
Yeah, because I remember my father had to go out. The airlines called. I think Mr. Jones got the news first. He called my father and he said, do you want me to go? And my dad said, no, I'll go. Because they didn't want Virginia to hear it on the news. And so they went out, and she didn't wake up their son. And the next morning, he turned on his radio and he heard it on the radio. And that little boy locked himself in his room. I was just very sad. He had his dog, and he just wouldn't come out of his room. It was just, yeah. It was a terrible time. We stayed very close to Virginia. She remarried out of state after her boys were through college and so forth. But she would come back and visit, and she always stayed with my mother.
What nationality is Wolfram?
German. Yes. In fact, the word Wolfram in Germany it's the name of an ore. It's tungsten, which there again is interesting power.
Yeah.
And there's a town of Wolfram. We went and visited. It's a little village. Dominantly Lutheran. His parents were Lutheran in the Pennsylvania area, Pittsburgh. It had something von Wolfram is also a character of Wagner's in Parsifal, and it might have been what initiated my father's interest in Wagner. But he liked bombastic music, and along with the heritage of Germany, he just was studying, and because although a lot of people with the family and during the Hitler regime, Wagner himself, the old man, the real Wagner, because his son Siegfried, and a lot of them ended up, but the father, of course, would have been pre-Hitler days, and would have been like any young boy on a campus. Naturally, he became a radical for change. Most young people on campuses have, fault find. But it was Siegfried, his son, and Siegfried's wife that were cozy with Hitler. Because then one of Hitler's daughters, not Hitler's, Friedland and Siegfried Wagner, one of their daughters, which would be a granddaughter of the Wagner composer, was in a school during World War II, private school, and Toscanini helped her escape to this country. And she became, Friedland, she became a good friend of my father's when she started this work. And that's how we got to Bayreuth, because her oldest brother, Wolfgang, and her mother, still Nazis, And this would have been in 60, because it was in my father's retirement that we went over there. Would have been 66, 67 in there, that they were still having meetings. You'd see them in their black uniforms, and they'd had a swastika. But the brother that Friedland was accepted, because the family didn't accept Friedland, but her brother, see, Wolfgang was with the mother, and Wieland was his name, Wieland, and he was the one that reconstructed the Wagnerian operas through light and shadows, rather than using these big, huge, cumbersome scenes and all this, and the props and everything. But he died, unfortunately, very young. And so I don't know whether Friedland was ever allowed to go back or not, but it was through that brother that she was allowed to. And she worked with Fulbright and had many young opera students from the United States go over there and study, and my father helped finance a lot of those scholarships too. So it was,
what happened to this ranch out by San Francisco?
my mother sold it. I was busy raising a family, and I certainly would never presume to tell my mother what to do with any of her money. I figured she and my father had earned every penny of it, and if they blew it or she gave it away or whatever, that was entirely her business. So I didn't stay as close to it as perhaps I should have. It is a shame that we ever sold the land. And I found after her death pencil scribblings of my father's. He hadn't put them in the will yet. He had not legalized his wishes. But he had said, to lease off, lease the land, sell everything off the ranch, but lease the land and hang on the land. And he had it in a 25-year that whoever did buy it could not do anything but agriculture. They couldn't develop it. See, he was only about 45 miles northeast of San Francisco. Be extremely valuable land today if we had it, but we don't have it. And it was between Novato and Petaluma. So what
nationality is your mother?
She was English. And I think there's French, a little French on both sides. I know my grandmother on my father's side was French.
Do you
Oh yes, she lived with us at 825 Sparrow. Those days, you kept the family together, and so yeah, she was with us a lot, and very active for us, very young for her age.
I know the intermediate car, the F-85.
Yes.
Father must have been in.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. In fact, what did they present him with? Was it the Starfire that was near 64, 65? They presented him with his retirement, a beautiful convertible. I remember because he demanded air conditioning, and everybody laughed at him, air conditioning a convertible. He said, well, I want, if I've got the top down and my head's cooled off, he said, I want my feet cooled off too. So I remember, that was a beautiful car that they presented him with.
Do you remember anything about that he had any pressure put on him from the corporation that they didn't want to?
Yes. Yeah, they did. They didn't, but he went ahead with it.
Would the car have been given to another division, or wasn't the corporation?
It would have been Chevrolet, I would think.
Well, now what about the Tornado? He probably had a.
Yes, those it was just, and the keeping the 98 the big car.
Was there a problem doing that?
Well, you see, this was pre all the suits and all the scandal of that engine was the same engine they put in Cadillac. The only difference between a 98 and a Cadillac in those days was just the name, practically, and the outside, maybe that body. But the inside was a 98 Olds. And then, of course, as in the smaller cars and the different things that Olds made, they were using the Chevy motor. And unfortunately, they didn't, I don't think they were trying to hide it from the public. I don't think they thought anything about it. It was a General Motors product, so they thought they were safe. But they found out differently when the public got irate about it. And, so I guess if you paid for a Cadillac and found out you had an Oldsmobile engine, you might be mad. Same way if you paid for an Oldsmobile and found out you had a Chevy engine. But it shouldn't have been, because the engineering skills and the worth of it was still the same,
What about deciding on color schemes for automobiles?
Oh, that was during that flamboyant era. And color was coming into everything, though. And I think they took the tip from fashion. And there again, with the advent of definitely the second car family, because the wife suddenly was having a car. I can remember Daddy asking my mother and I both, You know, if you had a car, what color would you like it? And we didn't want a black car. We didn't want, you know, the flamboyant colors came out with the buying cars for the wives and getting from the first car family, second car, and then third car family. Yeah, that
probably held true with interior company.
Definitely. And the different materials were being invented and proven, you know. In fact, I used to always have great talks with Tom Hendy. I said, let me know before that auction goes on. And I have today, my dining room chairs, which I scrub every year and they just come out beautifully, are upholstery material. I was able to pick up at the auction. They always have the leftover rolls, what wasn't going to be used again, and you could go in and get them, pick them up. Wonderful materials. Yeah, this is a gold brocade. It's just very, and wears like iron.
It does.
Uh-huh, yeah.
Well, Evie, you've given us a wonderfully umbrella type comprehension.
Well, I think maybe I got a lot of personal things into it, but I would hope that if some young person were listening to this, even though the era of self-made, quote unquote, which my father said was impossible, but the idea of getting anywhere without an education. Unfortunately, that may seem to be gone, but what it took to do that should not be gone. They should just be able to accomplish twice as much. And I think there again with the family problems that we've been having with our youngsters the last decade or so with drugs and everything, that perhaps a second look too, that if couples get married and it's a two-job family, that then they save enough to have that family, so at least maybe in those early years the mother can stay home. There's a lot needed in society for the volunteer, and so she certainly could have a balance to her life. Because I know my father said to me one time, he says, I don't know if educating you is going to be good or not. He says, you can't train a racehorse without letting him run. And when this equality thing started, I remember my husband was asked one time if what Evie thought about this woman's lib movement. And my husband's statement was, I don't think she wants to go back to being equal. So it's the change that took place. And my father was in a very advantageous position at a very interesting time in history.
How did he see women's role as it was emerging in the so-called man's world?
He respected it, and he realized that it had to come. And he was worried about the family, but I think we hadn't started yet to have homes for senior citizens. The sick might be put away in a nursing home, but people weren't just living there. We didn't have the crime rate yet. We didn't have the other social problems that are having decisions being made why people do choose and opt to live in a retirement home. It's safety. It's and also, you know, the lawn care, the upkeep of a home. I mean, the tax, everything has changed so that you couldn't anticipate this. And in the era that my father would have been aware of, that he probably saw that maybe the grandparents would be of help to raising the children and that influence, such as his mother had been. But there again, we all went. You know, I think there might have been a trip at one time, and I'm sure it was during the time working in the hydromatic dry, that my father was near a nervous breakdown. And Oldsmobile sent him on a cruise. And it was during the Depression, so the medical cruise had not been filled up. And Waldo's let General Motors aware through Dr. Carr. He was the industrial doctor, and he went to many industries. He wasn't just housed at Oldsmobile at the time. They helped arrange this, and my parents went on a cruise. So at that time, my grandmother and my uncle moved in, and she was, you know, a full-time babysitter. But ordinarily, we would go out with my parents, and my grandmother might even go, because she was included if there was a card game. You know, we seem now to have lost some of that. And I think when my father thought it was good for the women to come up in life, and also to be self-sufficient, not just for the extra money in a household, but maybe the bread earner. But you see, we weren't dealing with divorces in those days either. You weren't. If there was desertion of a man running off, you didn't hear about it as much. And so the widows that did need to work, you know, he was all for it. In fact, he loved his secretaries. You would know. Remember Irma? And as he used to tease Irma. He says, well, you know, he says, the thing with this job, he says, I don't get to hire you. He says, I inherit you. She had more seniority than he did because she'd worked for Mr. Skinner, and he'd had another one, and then Irma came in next, and he had Jerry was with my dad after Irma, and but I'm trying to think who Irma followed. It had been Mr. Skinner's.
Oh,
She stayed. Yes, she stayed. I remember seeing those. Mother used to have those girls for lunch. Well, after my father passed on, they were very interesting because they were pioneers. And but that was, when you think about it, my father was very discouraged because he didn't know why I wanted to go into show business. That wasn't going to make any money. That I really should be a private secretary and go through that. Well, typing gave me up, and so therefore I gave typing up. But it's fun to look back, and I appreciate this opportunity because I don't find myself thinking about it as extensively as I have had to ever since you called me to relive those memories.
You mentioned a nervous breakdown.
Yes, that was he didn't. That was in the early 30s, and I think they were just. It was the stress, I think, of not being formally educated and working on such important information, and overworking. He was a workaholic. I mean, we did not. And even on a vacation, if we did take a vacation, he was testing the car. You know, we'd be in a company car because we didn't have a car of our own. And but no, he worked very hard, and he had a very conscientious attitude. If we were at the dinner table, lots of times, you didn't talk until Daddy talked, because he could have been in this train of thought that you wouldn't interrupt it unless he brought it up. You know. There was an interesting time, too, when you speak of the hydromatic drive and the automatic transmission, and then they kept making improvements on this. During the war, he bought a farm out by DeWitt, and the idea was get like 10 acres and raise some chicken and some pigs maybe or something, because they were going to be raising meat and so on and so forth. Well, my mother says, don't sell East Lansing home. Don't sell my home for underneath it. So they rented that, and they bought this farm. And I was just highly incensed that I would have to leave East Lansing High School and go to DeWitt. I thought, oh my Lord, my throat was cut. But we would see him sometimes coming down with these experimental cars, and he'd be coming home backwards. It had gotten caught in reverse, and he couldn't go forward. And he'd be wheeling down the road in that. But he liked that little drive. It was about 13 miles.
Where was this farm located?
Wood Road. It was the old Conklin farm. It's right on the Looking Glass River on Wood Road. It's still there. It was 160 acres, but it's been subdivided. There's 2 or 3 little houses that I've seen on them when I pass. But the main house is still there, and all the little fir trees that were tiny in my day are gigantic now. Yeah, he enjoyed that. I think that helped him relax. He was. Oh, I don't know if he had ulterior motives. It seemed to me that he had it until I went away to college. It's just like, because with the B stamps, it was hard for me to be dating, sitting out there on that dumb farm. But I learned to drive on at the farm. I drove a little tractor around.
After the war.
It was during the war and afterwards. He sold it. He sold that, and yeah, I think my brother's illness could have had a lot to do with that, because then he bought another farm which my brother managed during his illness out at it's on the corner of College Road and Holt Road. And there again, you know, Mr. Inger and Mr. Hacker, a lot of the early real estate people, you know, wanted him to subdivide that land, and he didn't want to do that to the ground any more than he did with the ranch. He didn't want it to be subdivided. He didn't want it. Of course, it's all built up now, all of that area. But he felt that we should hang on to the land. So in his own way, without realizing he was an environmentalist, and he didn't know it.
Yeah.
But he respected the land, and where that came from, being born in Pittsburgh, and that you just wonder. But probably in his reading, something hit him. He was very close to the College of Agriculture at Michigan State, gave a great deal of money. Very good friend of John Hanna. And
Did he like animals?
always, yeah, we always had animals. Oh, heavens. At 825 Sparrow, we had a big Newfoundland dog. We had a little tiny hunting dog. One of my uncles hunted. And we had goldfish, and we had cats. My grandmother had cats. And we had a parrot. That was the chief engineer, when my father was assistant chief, was a man by the name of Harold Youngman. And he did have a divorce, which was quite a scandal at the time. But they had this parrot, and neither one of them wanted it. So my mother thought she was babysitting the parrot during the divorce proceeding, but we ended up with the parrot, and we didn't want anything to happen to that parrot. So we had that parrot for years. My mother had that parrot, long after my father died. In fact, I think the parrot died just maybe a year or so before my mother died.
Gracious.
Yes, they have very longevity. And she had in her will, which we were glad the parrot went early. I didn't realize she'd done this, but the parrot was to be put to sleep. She was afraid it would be mistreated if it became a pet in anybody else's home, little children or children coming in. Maybe the family wouldn't, but the outsiders. And they called him Porgy. And he sang. My brother and I taught him sing different songs. If you put something over the cage with any kind of a bird that can talk, and then repeating and repeating, they're not distracted by anything. And also, if you start them before they see or hear other birds. Particularly with a parakeet, if they hear an outside bird, or if there's a canary or something else in the house, they're very hard to teach. My grandmother had a parakeet too. Oh yeah, we were very animal lovers.
What did your mother call your father?
This was funny, honey. And so when my children, and my niece my brother's daughter was born first, she called him honey. She thought that was his name, because my mother would say, "Come on, honey, it's time to go home," or she'd say honey. So she called him honey, and that stuck. And everybody, all adults, all of his friends, everybody called him honey.
Okay.
Yeah.
What did he call her?
Ev.
Ev.
Ev. Yeah, I was Evelyn, and then I named my daughter. I have 4 sons and a daughter, and I named her Evelyn. So, but she's Evie Ann. We refer to her as that, and I'm Evie. But it was fun too, because then my mother's nickname was Baba. And all my friends called her Baba. Everybody called her Baba. But my niece was the first grandchild, and her favorite story that my mother would read was Baba Black Sheep, the nursery rhymes.
Yeah.
And she'd get her little nursery rhyme book and crawl up on my mother's lap and say, "Baba, Baba." And that just stuck. So it was kind of cute.
Did Mr. Wolfram like it and enjoy his grandchildren?
Yes, but on an adult level. Now, both my son and Jill, right or wrong, they have mixed emotions about themselves, quite often would be taken on these trips. Like at the age of 6, they're seeing My Fair Lady, and they're going to operas and stuff. And it was demanded that they were a little lady and gentleman, which, as I say, it's hard. They have mixed emotions. I think they feel very secure socially, but their lifestyle now doesn't reflect any of that or demand any of that. And so consequently, they weren't there as children. They were there as miniature adults. And
that's the way Mr. Wolfram perceived
yes,
any child.
Definitely. He didn't talk down to a child. He met them on their own. Now, in retirement, this became different. Retirement, again, through his reading, he kind of became a connoisseur of children. And my mother and I used to just kind of roll our eyes because he hadn't helped raise my brother and I, and he certainly hadn't helped me with my other children, but the last 2, and particularly my daughter. He was just very, very taken with her, and he had time. My last 2 children, he really had time for them, so. But he would come, they ate at our house a lot, and he would always pose puzzles. A lot of them are well known now, but he would present them to my boys, and then they better have the answer the following week when he came to dinner. And it would be like the one about the man who went to the jail. He said, "Well, are you a relative to see this prisoner?" And the man replies, yes, brothers and sisters, I have none, but that man's father is my father's son. And then, of course, the riddle is, what relationship is he to the prisoner? So those kind of things, all those little brain teasers he would give them, written and oral.
Suppose they got the wrong answer, then what?
Well, they didn't.
Okay.
And maybe my mother had something to do with them knowing the answer. I don't know. But there again, every Sunday they were at my house for dinner, and then after my father passed, it was at my mother's house. And again, you know, right or wrong, my children have mixed emotions too. They couldn't plan anything for during that time. I mean, you were at my mother's for dinner on Sunday, which meant, you know, their social life and their peers. I think there was pressure the other way, perhaps, but it was never discussed. She expected us, and that's where we were. Oh, definitely. And she did all her own cooking. She was a wonderful cook. Had a lot of. Well, she did all of her own cooking for all the big parties that they had to give. The alcohol and the cocktails would be, you know, they would have Archie Tarpoff, or they'd have Campbell was just starting. In fact, I had Campbell because I had worked with United Way, and I got acquainted with Campbell Catering. And he'd never done private parties. He only did the Civic Center and big things. And so I had him do my mother and father's 50th wedding anniversary. That was at their home. Yeah, it was in 1970, spring of 1970, and then he died the spring of 1971. So they had, and he had it, and then he met Beltz's, and he met a lot of the Oldsmobile people, and from then on, his business was influenced too, because he had to start out as a young person, and was called more and more to entertain the area. There was something else that rang a bell a minute ago when I was mentioning it. I wanted to bring up about the parties that they gave. Oh, I've missed it. If it's important, I'll have to write it on a note. It was talking about her doing all her own cooking. Oh, the fact that they never had any live-in help. My mother did all her own work, and she sewed for my father. And when the fashion came in with these real thin pants that they wore, well, he turned his ankle. He broke his ankle in New York. And when they took him, they just, you know, they put the cast on the ankle. He just kind of held up his pants. So when he got home, they couldn't get the pants off. He flew. It was, you know, flight was a day meeting. So my mother got the razor blade, and she slipped that up the inseam, and they got the pants off all right. And then she re-sewed them for him. But there again, you talk about one of my father's traits, good or bad, it was his pride. And he would have his driver, John Essenberg, pick him up and take him to work by 7:30. So he was in his office sitting up straight, and no one ever saw him on crutches. Talk about false pride. But the same thing happened. I guess it went with when you're going to accomplish something. When he had a heart attack once, and he was in Detroit, Ford Hospital. I was after attending the opera that evening. So then they just kept him over. And I remember when the other vice presidents would come to see him, and the president at the time, he had a suite, of course, at the hospital, and he made the nurses and everybody wheel him to the couch and be in a sitting position. He said, I will not have any of my peers looking down on me. And he wouldn't lie in bed to be visited. He was going to be in an upright position, which is just a little insight to the makings of that kind of a man, I guess. Yes, and an important trait. He took pride in all of that.
Well, Evelyn, I know you have a deadline.
Yes, I do, and I
Would you like to share with us?
not that's at the top of my head right now.
Maybe, you know, after, I'd like to come up and look through the things that you...
Yes, because I'm picking up my daughter this afternoon. That's what my deadline is. She's coming in, and that's one of the jobs she has to help me do, because she also has to get a lot of her things out.
Okay.
She's 26 now, and it's been away enough that I think that home is not going to be anything but where she visits. So when we do that, I will definitely...
Let me we could come up and.
And I'll take notes as I think of things, and then when I hear the tape, if it's not on the tape, we'll add it.
Okay, that's
Okay.
a wonderful idea. In
Okay.
fact, I'll send you an extra tape or two along. Why
Yeah,
not?
my children would like that because they've been after me a long time, and they said, you've got to tell some of the stories just with my parents' background.
Why don't we do it like this? Why don't we make a copy of the tape and just send you one copy? Then if you decide there's something you want deleted or you
Good,
want to
okay.
change, then we can have another copy made for your children.
Wonderful.
But
That'd
I'll
be
send a
great.
couple of empty tapes along in case. Do you have a tape recorder?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I
Thought you
appreciate that.
probably did. Then
Yeah.
if you think of something, you could just have your tape
Uh-huh.
in and
Plug it in, it'd be great.
make a record of it.
Oh,
And then
wonderful.
I'll be glad to come up and look at pictures or papers. And if you do have only one copy, like say of a
Yeah, we
picture,
would make it then.
well, no, we
Mhm.
can do that. We've done that with other people. People
Okay.
want to maintain the original themselves. It's theirs. They should.
Uh-huh.
But they do give us the privilege or the opportunity to make a copy.
Mhm.
Then, and as your original is in the same condition, same quality as it was when you loaned it, so.
Yeah,
Either
that's,
use
uh-huh.
GM, let it switch, take care of these things very well, or anything for that matter. So,
Yeah, their names in at the bottom of a lot of these pictures.
right, yes, very
Yes.
high quality photographers.
And they, in Oldsmobile, used them a long time.
Yes, they did.
Mhm.
And I appreciate your signing the agreement form.
No, I'm just very, very pleased that you asked me to do this. When that letter came, I was very pleased someone had done this. I wasn't aware that it had happened, and particularly now with the changes that are taking place in General Motors, it's
Yes.
very valuable to have this history of
Well,
Oldsmobile.
it is for us. It's a wonderful addition.
Because it's part of Lansing's history. Yeah,
Yes, it
it's part
is.
of Lansing's history.
It's a very significant historic
Mhm.
document.
Okay,
I'm
thank you,
shut
dear.
us off here.